of the promissory obligation. As the purported central banking systems which have been imposed upon the world therefore merely intervene upon the natural roles of the promissory obligation, merely to pretend that to publish evidence of our promissory obligations to each other is as much as to grant credit for property which is only actually given up by the actual creditor, which actual creditor accepts the promissory obligation for property given up, and which actual creditor is even denied interest by a mere publisher of the evidence of our promissory obligations to each other, itself disproving any purported claim to interest by the mere publisher. 3a. A first monumental crime of the present systems of exploitation, therefore, is that they launder vast principle into the ever unjustifiable possession of mere money changers, whereas, on the contrary, the purported banking system never gives up, nor therefore is itself ever owed such extents or representations of property. 3a1. And whereas, therefore, as the obligation to retire payment of principal from circulation still persists in the inherent roles and life cycle of every veritable unexploited promissory obligation, 3a1a, thus a purposed obfuscation of this principle in the inherent roles and life cycle of every veritable unexploited promissory obligation exists for the sole purpose of exploitation, because no other power or purpose exists in the obfuscation but exploitation. B. It is entirely a lie, therefore, that we borrow money from a purported banking system. For on the contrary, the original money never even exists to be borrowed, and is only issued in indispensable coincidence and very representation of our issuance of our promissory obligations to each other. B1. To and in which obligations the purported banking system is not even an intrinsic party, as it gives up no lawful consideration in obfuscating an entirely falsified purported debt to itself. B2. And which obligations are strictly the people's in the first place. So if I make comment here, these are things which are vital for us to understand in understanding the fact of singular solution and a vital transformation to this fact of one and one only solution. B. A second and even more monumental and destructive crime of the imposed systems of exploitation, therefore, is that without warrant or justification, this unassented and unauthorizable obfuscation of the currency multiplies artificial indebtedness into terminal artificial indebtedness by an implicit obligation to maintain a vital circulation. With this implicit obligation generally fulfilled, and generally only fulfillable, therefore, by perpetually reborrowing principal and interest paid out of the general circulation in the way of servicing the ever-escalated sum of artificial debt. And with this perpetual reborrowing of principal and interest, or indispensable reflation of a circulation which is itself comprised never of more than some remaining principal, and which circulation of some remaining principal yet is perpetually deflated not only of all ostensibly owed principal, but by potentially vast, ever unjustified sums of interest, potentially vastly exceeding the circulation itself. With a necessary reborrowing of principal, therefore, to that extent, making it mathematically impossible to pay down any such prior sum of debt. With a necessary reborrowing of interest, therefore, increasing the sum of prior artificial indebtedness by so much as periodic interest on every prior sum of artificial debt. And therefore, only so long as it remains possible for the subjects to maintain a vital circulation. With this implicit and unavoidable obligation of reflation, perpetually increasing a sum of artificial falsified indebtedness at inherently escalating rates of so much as ever greater sums of periodic interest. While the ever greater sums of periodic interest are commensurable to no more than the perpetually increasing sum of artificial falsified indebtedness, multiplied by no more than an unavoidable implicit obligation to maintain a vital volume of the obfuscated currency because of no more than the purposed criminal obfuscation itself. And while all along the course of which unjustifiable multiplication of artificial indebtedness, an inevitably terminal maldisposition manifests in ever greater portions of the circulation being artificially disposed to servicing debt, as opposed to, and at the very cost of any potential remaining capacity for sustaining the vital industry which remains obligated to service the perpetually escalated sum of falsified debt. With this perpetual multiplication of falsified indebtedness being irreversible for the limited while, so long as the subjects can succeed in maintaining a vital circulation. With their potential creditworthiness to maintain a vital circulation, therefore, eventually and inevitably exceeded by maldisposition in an inevitable sum of artificial debt which exceeds the remaining capacity to sustain the industry which is obligated to service the perpetual escalation of falsified indebtedness. And with the people's inevitable failure to maintain a vital circulation, therefore, ultimately resulting inherently in overwhelming, catastrophic failure in a final phase of an inherent cycle culminating in terminal deflation. With this terminal deflation being an inevitable consequence of no more than a fact that the ever unwarranted process of the purposed exploitation inherently multiplies an ever-increasing sum of falsified indebtedness in proportion to remaining capacity to pay. And with this inevitable failure to persist in the creditworthiness which is indispensable to maintaining a vital circulation, by a perpetual escalation of artificially necessitated borrowing, therefore, culminating in the present inevitable failure. Thus, entirely by obfuscation, entirely by impropriety, entirely without justification, and opposing an inevitable breadth of terminal dispossession, even as this implicit obligation to borrow at interest cannot be justified by purported risk, because all that is risked is the mere costs of publication, because the mere costs of publication are generally recouped at least in but a tiny fraction of the usual first payment against every such obfuscation of the natural roles and life cycle of a promissory obligation, and because the people can, of course, issue their own promissory obligations not only without suffering such injustices, but even at negligible total cost. Therefore, the categoric faults of 1. Circulatory inflation, deflation, and maladisposition; 2. Systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property; and 3. Inherent, irreversible, and therefore terminal multiplication of artificial indebtedness, not only engender terminal failure, but multiply the injustices of the imposed systems of dispossession into absolute dispossession and injustice all along the way to terminal failure. And therefore we, the people, may rightly conclude that the ever-escalating injustices of these crimes against us are no more than an unnecessary, easily solved, ever unwarranted product of purposed exploitation, sealed by purposed criminal obfuscation, perpetrated by concerted, perpetual denial of representation. And thus a third ever treasonous crime against the people is that in order to persist in this purposed, ever-destructive obfuscation of the currency, the pretended banking system is too unrightly empowered to deploy vast unearned takings to subvert every conduit of representation which might otherwise succeed in a vital restoration of justice. 4. Obligation to arrest and to repair the consequences of the monetary crimes against us. Therefore, a vast array of injustices and criminal intent to persist in these crimes ensues, compelling us not only to arrest, but to every practical extent to repair the consequences of the present criminal obfuscation of the currency by immediately establishing mathematically perfected economy and absolute consensual representation, which mathematically perfected economy necessarily restores the right of every person, however individually or collectively, to issue legitimate, certifiable, enforceable promissory obligations, and to pay off resultant obligations at no less than the rate of consumption or depreciation of the related property, all of which are performed on our behalf by a common monetary foundry, adhering to these principles in indispensable strictures prescribed, policed, and enforceable by the people. Thus the categoric faults of the present obfuscation of the promissory obligation are solved singularly by a fact of mathematically perfected economy, which itself is comprised of no more than an eradication of interest and an obligatory schedule of payment, retiring principal,